Most Americans believe they know the story of World War II, a story where freedom-loving nations stood together against Hitler, a story where the United States led the charge and the Soviet Union was their powerful ally. But what if that story is incomplete? What if, at the very beginning of the war, the Soviet Union was not a liberator, but a partner of Nazi Germany? In 1939, secret pacts were signed, borders were redrawn, entire nations were carved up behind closed doors. And while the world remembers D-Day, very few remember the invasion of Poland from both east and west, or the brutal Soviet attack on Finland. This is the forgotten story of World War II, a story of betrayal, ambition, and a shocking alliance that changed the fate of millions.
World War II. Who really helped Germany?
You know the story of World War II, that the United States and its allies bravely stood against Hitler, saving the world from tyranny. That history is simple. Evil rises, heroes fight, the world is freed. But what if I told you the story you learned in school is only half the truth? What if some of the nations we now celebrate as heroes were not so heroic at all? Before Hitler invaded Poland, before the United States even entered the war, before the Allies were aware of the full scale of the horrors to come, the Soviet Union was already playing a very different game. This is the story of secret pacts, invasions, and a controversial partnership between two nations that many would never expect: Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, and the years we rarely hear about, 1939 to 1941. These 2 years are the darkest and most shocking part of the story, a part that rarely makes it into textbooks, documentaries, or classrooms in the United States.
1939. Europe was on edge, waiting for the inevitable clash between Hitler and his neighbors. And then came the shocking announcement. Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. To the world, it was a promise of peace. But behind the scenes, there was a secret protocol. Poland would be divided. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania would fall under Soviet influence. Finland and Romania were eyed for expansion. This was not peace. This was a calculated plan for conquest, signed by two of the most powerful nations on the continent. Imagine the leaders of Germany and the USSR, Hitler and Stalin, shaking hands while secretly planning invasions, occupations, and the suppression of millions of people. Foreign diplomats were kept in the dark. Intelligence reports hinted at danger, but the true scale of the agreement was hidden. By the end of 1939, these secret plans would be set in motion, and the world would witness events that would shock generations. The world had no idea that a major power, the USSR, was aligning itself with one of history's most notorious dictators, at least temporarily.
September 1st, 1939. Germany invades Poland using blitzkrieg tactics. Tanks, aircraft, and infantry moving at terrifying speed. The world reacts. War has officially begun. But the story is more complex than the typical narrative. On September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union crosses the eastern border of Poland. Two massive armies, striking almost simultaneously, crush the Polish army and occupy large portions of the country. Polish forces under Marshal Edward Reed-Schmigli are overwhelmed. Cities are occupied, civilians are killed, and thousands are deported to Siberia. The total Polish military and civilian casualties in the first months exceed 200,000. The commanders of the Soviet forces include Semyon Timoshenko and a young Georgy Zhukov, whose military career was advancing rapidly through these early operations. On the German side, generals such as Heinz Guderian led the armored divisions that tore through Polish defenses. The contrast is chilling. The USSR, later celebrated as a hero in the war, was actively partnering with Germany to crush a small nation, Poland, and take part in a brutal division of territory. This is not a story often told in classrooms. 2 years before the celebrated Soviet resistance, the USSR was complicit in aggression alongside Hitler. November 30th, 1939. The Soviet Union attacks Finland. The Winter War begins. The Red Army, numbering over 450,000 soldiers, expected a swift victory. But Finland, a tiny nation with barely 300,000 men under arms, resisted fiercely. For 4 months, Finnish forces, often using skis and guerrilla tactics, inflicted heavy casualties. Over 126,000 Soviet soldiers were killed, 264,000 were wounded, and tens of thousands more were captured or missing. Finnish losses totaled around 25,000. The Soviet commanders, including Kliment Voroshilov and Semyon Meretskov, underestimated the Finns, leading to disastrous assaults and high losses. Cities were bombed, forests burned, and the population suffered immensely. Heroic resistance became legendary, but in the larger narrative, the Soviet Union's aggressive invasion is often overshadowed by its later role in the war. This was not a defensive act. It was expansionist aggression, one of the first large-scale conflicts the USSR engaged in during the early war years. History rarely acknowledges this truth. The Soviet Union, which Americans later celebrate as a hero of World War II, was at this point the aggressor, invading, killing, and expanding its influence. In 1940, the Soviet Union annexed Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Almost overnight, these countries disappeared from the map. Meanwhile, Bessarabia and northern Bukovina were forcibly incorporated from Romania. Governments were dissolved, resistance was crushed, and populations were subjected to mass arrests and deportations to labor camps in Siberia. Tens of thousands of people were exiled. The world, focused on Germany's aggression, barely noticed these events. Stalin reshaped Eastern Europe quietly, while textbooks later presented the USSR as a defender against fascism. The human toll was staggering. Families torn apart, entire communities uprooted, and the seeds of long-term oppression planted, all before the USSR officially joined the fight against Germany.
Germany and the USSR maintained complex diplomatic relations. Trade agreements allowed the USSR to supply Germany with oil, grain, and raw materials critical to its war machine. German diplomats discussed joint strategies for controlling Europe, while Soviet leaders balanced expansion with caution. The world only saw snapshots of these negotiations, unaware of the calculated power plays taking place behind closed doors. The USSR's relationship with Germany was not static. It was opportunistic, strategic, and at times shocking in its pragmatism, partnering with one of history's greatest villains until the moment Hitler betrayed Stalin.
1941. Operation Barbarossa. Hitler breaks the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and launches the largest invasion in history against the Soviet Union. Within weeks, millions of Soviet troops are engaged. Casualties are staggering. Over 4 million killed, wounded, or captured in the first months. Cities burn. Millions of civilians are displaced or executed. German commanders, including Heinz Guderian and Fyodor von Bock, push deep into Soviet territory. Soviet commanders, including Georgy Zhukov, struggle to reorganize. The narrative changes. The USSR, once a partner of Germany, is now portrayed as a heroic defender. The scale of suffering is enormous. Yet the early years, the years when the USSR acted as aggressor, are often forgotten. This dramatic reversal shows how fluid history can be. Heroes and villains are often determined by which side you stand on, or by which year you examine.
1939 through 1941, USSR allies with Germany, invades Poland, attacks Finland, annexes the Baltics and Bessarabia. 1941 Through 1945, USSR fights Germany, suffers unimaginable losses, and becomes celebrated as a hero. The contrast is staggering. The same nation, depending on the year, can be an aggressor or a savior. The simplified narratives taught in schools erase the darker, inconvenient truths of these early years.
Never black and white. The stories we are taught are often convenient narratives designed to create heroes and villains. The Soviet Union's early role in World War II, secret deals, invasions, occupations, is one of those inconvenient truths. So the next time you think you know who won World War II, pause, look closer, research deeper, because the truth is often far more complex, far darker, and far more fascinating than the stories we are told.